In this video, we'll be going over which dungeons are the longest, basically in terms of how many bosses they have. And at number 10, we kind of have a 6-way tie between the Dead Mines, Blackfathom Deeps, Uldaman, Miraidon, Return to Karazhan, and Operation Mechagon, all of which have a grand total of 8 bosses. Although Classic Dead Mines has 2 optional bosses in there, but is a ridiculously big dungeon, and was used as a benchmark for how big a dungeon should be in Vanilla WoW. But Return to Karazhan technically has a secret 9th boss if you summon it correctly, so Karazhan has to take the number 10 spot on that front. Return to Karazhan and Operation Mechagon are both mega dungeons that were added in the past 2 expansions, so they're the 2 biggest dungeons added recently, ever since the Burning Crusade, where they started to make nothing but small dungeons, reminiscent of the Scarlet Monastery Wings. In Vanilla WoW, the average amount of bosses per dungeon was around 8.9, whereas in the Burning Crusade, the expansion immediately following Classic, the average drops down all the way to 3.5 bosses per dungeon. According to Vanilla WoW developers, they originally designed vanilla dungeons big because they thought people would only do them a single time, because that was kind of the norm in the early days of MMOs, where instance dungeons weren't regular. So since they thought they'd only really do them once, they made them big and gigantic. And then they found out people don't like those when they have to run them over and over, and they much prefer smaller dungeons. That's why a majority of dungeons in the game have less than 5 bosses each, and only a few exceptions go to the numbers, which would allow them to make the number 10 spot on this list. Pretty much every other dungeon in this video will just be another one from Vanilla WoW, when the normal dungeon was a mega dungeon. And at number 9, we have the Wailing Caverns, which has a grand total of 9 bosses, including one rare spawn boss named Deviate Fairy Dragon. Now, when it comes to long dungeons, the Wailing Caverns is incredibly fitting for that title, as it's basically a gigantic maze that you have to navigate in order to kill a whole bunch of plant monsters, snakes, dinosaurs, and some druids. The Vanilla WoW version was much bigger than the one we have in the retail version of the game, as it has an entire maze section added to the right-hand side of the map, and is even one of those dungeons that has a mini-dungeon before the dungeon entrance. When they were told to design Wailing Caverns at first, they were basically told to just make a cave with dinosaurs running around, so they kind of went a little crazy with that description and tried to make a big place to accommodate all of those running dinosaurs. And the maze section was just something they were trying out for fun, but ended up being frustrating when people actually started to playtest the maze. So they added in mushrooms in order to guide people through the proper exit point, which blended in so well with the rest of the foliage that no one actually ever knew there was even a path of mushrooms in the first place. When it comes to really low-level dungeons in Classic WoW, Wailing Caverns is the biggest, in terms of boss count and the dimensions of the dungeons itself. Fun fact, the reason so many dungeons had mini-dungeons before the entrance of the dungeon was because in EverQuest, there used to be a common room outside the dungeon entrances. That way, people could kill mobs while they waited for people to show up, because the best way to level in EverQuest was to grind mobs. So it made sense to give them mobs to grind in WoW as well, which really didn't end up being the case. It was just kind of annoying to the average player instead. And at number 8, we have Shadowfang Keep, clocking in at a grand total of 10 bosses in its Classic WoW version. This was a dungeon not much higher level than the Wailing Caverns, tuned for players levels 22 to 30, and located in the Silver Pine Forest. The dungeon itself is not as big physically as the Wailing Caverns, but it does have one more boss, with none of them being rare bosses that you need to look for. It is actually tied with another dungeon for having 10 bosses, although I'll talk about that one in a bit. Now, most raids don't have 10 bosses in them. In fact, Shadowfang Keep has more bosses than all but one raid from Battle for Azeroth, with only Ny'alotha beating it out with a grand total of 12 bosses. Although when they revamped the dungeon in Cataclysm, they cut the number of bosses in half, and it's a lot more in line with most other dungeons at only 5 bosses. 5 bosses is kind of the upper limit for modern dungeons. Rarely do they go above 5 bosses unless it's a mega dungeon. And at number 7, we have the Temple of Atal'Hakkar, or more commonly known as the Sunken Temple, clocking in at a grand total of 10 bosses as well. Although the Temple of Atal'Hakkar is a little bit bigger space-wise, and has a gigantic maze before the entrance of the dungeon, so I have it a little bit higher on the list. This place had it all, a gigantic maze-like structure, hidden rooms, multiple levels, an entire second level dedicated to one secret boss, where you had to click 6 statues in the right order in order to spawn it, and a whole bunch of class quests that sent you to the place. So it was one of the first mega dungeons that people would try to complete, outside of maybe running Wailing Caverns in the early levels, because Sunken Temple was bigger than most raids even. which is not the case for all of the dungeons that will appear in this video. Some of them might have more bosses than raids, but they weren't physically bigger. Sunken Temple was definitely both of those things. That's why when they revamped the dungeon in Cataclysm, they just kind of removed everything. They only left in one room of the place and cut it down to 4 bosses, down from its original 10. The Sunken Temple is a complete shell of its former self, and the only way to experience the Mega Dungeon version is to play it in Classic WoW, which at least is an option nowadays. And at number 6, we have Zul'Farrak. This outdoor dungeon has a grand total of 12 bosses, including an optional 13th boss that can only be summoned by completing a quest. Although of the 13 bosses, 3 of them are rares that won't spawn every time you do the dungeon, and of course one of them is the optional boss Gazrilla that you can't even do unless someone has the Mallet of Zul'Farrak that you obtain through a quest chain in the Arathi Highlands, all the way on the other side of the planet. Although having so many optional or rare spawn bosses is only a good thing in my opinion. With the revamp of the dungeon in the Cataclysm, it was lowered down to only 6 bosses you had to complete, and you no longer had to do a quest chain in the Arathi Highlands in order to summon Gazrilla, as he was just added as a normal boss in the instance instead. Next up at number 5, we have Scholomance, clocking in at a grand total of 13 bosses. Now we are starting to get into some of the higher level dungeons. These ones were meant to be done at max level in order to get some gear to start raiding, or to do the max level dungeons. And Scholomance definitely fits into this category, being the level ranges of 55 to 60, and having a lot of best pre-raid and gear slot pieces associated to it, as well as being the only place to craft alchemy flasks before Blackwing Lair came out. With the revamp of the dungeon in Mist of Pandaria, it was changed into a 5-boss instance, as well as having the lore of the place updated to take place after the events of the original. The original Scholomance is probably one of the creepiest places and pieces of lore they've added to the game, as it's a school for necromancers that used to be a mansion for rich people before the Cult of the Damned moved in and just kind of killed everyone there and experimented on them. Which is why it's the perfect place for Hearthstone to have a Harry Potter knockoff expansion, since it is a school and they did teach magic, and I will always find the Hearthstone trailer hilarious when contrasted to the actual origins of the place. And at number 4, we have Blackrock Spire, clocking in at a grand total of 14 bosses if you include the upper and lower portions, with the lower portion having 9 bosses and the upper having an additional 5. Both portions could be considered proper dungeons on their own. Again, this is another max level dungeon intended for players 55 to 60, and when they created these dungeons they went all out and tried to make them as big as possible, because they were told to make all of the big dungeons at least bigger than the Dead Mines, as the Dead Mines was kind of the marker for big or small dungeons. If it was bigger than the Dead Mines, then it was considered a big dungeon, and vice versa. Although this one might be a little bit iffy with its spot on the list, seeing as it's kind of 2 separate dungeons and are normally done separately. But whatever, it's close enough. When they revamped the place with the Cataclysm, they kind of left lower Blackrock Spire intact for the most part. And upper Blackrock Spire got a complete revamp in Warlords of Draenor and has different bosses, but funny enough, still the same amount in both, if you count both of them together. The modern versions also have 14 bosses, although a lot of the ones in lower Blackrock Spire are completely optional, with one of them even being a secret boss that you have to collect a whole bunch of items in a room in order to summon, and it's much more streamlined for a random dungeon finder. And at number 3, we have Stratholme, clocking in at a grand total of 19 bosses. I don't think there are even raids in the game that have 19 bosses in them. This is kind of big. Stratholme is another max level dungeon tuned for players 55 to 60, and kind of has multiple sections like Blackrock Spire, where there's a main gate and service gate sections, although both of them are located inside the same instance, so it's a lot easier to clump them together for the spot than Blackrock Spire. The main gate section has a grand total of 11 bosses, which would have put on this list as it beats out the number 7 and below spots, and the service gate has a total of 8 bosses, which would tie it for the number 10 spot on the list. So it just has a lot of bosses in both sections. Both of them would be big dungeons on their own, which is why they were normally ran that way. With its revamp in Cataclysm, it was split into 2 sides, the living side / main gate with only 7 bosses instead of 11, and the dead side / service entrance with 6 bosses down from the original 8. Stratholme also received a past version in Wrath of the Lich King, where you run around with Arthas in order to help him purge the city, which only had the standard 5 bosses like most Wrath dungeons. This is one of the few vanilla dungeons that kind of kept a high boss count with its Cataclysm revamp, and wasn't completely gutted like the Sunken Temple was. And at number 2, we have Dire Maul, clocking in at a grand total of 19 bosses as well. Dire Maul is another max level dungeon, which was added later on in Vanilla WoW and is split into 3 sections, with the east section having 5 bosses and the north and west sections both having 7 bosses each. Although this is kind of a cheat spot, as the dungeon currently is split up into 4 different dungeons with no way to go from one to the other. However, they are all on the same map, and at one point Dire Maul North and Dire Maul West were connected to one another. However, that was later removed. So unlike dungeons like Scarlet Monastery, these dungeons were at one point connected and share the same map. And just like with Stratholme, when it was revamped in the Cataclysm, they kind of kept it intact for the most part, as it still has around 16 bosses split between the 3 different versions. And finally, at number 1, we have Blackrock Depths, clocking in the grand total of 20 bosses, easily making it the biggest dungeon in the game, even when counting it against raids. It's funny they had dungeons in Vanilla WoW which were bigger than all of the raid instances when it came to boss count, but bosses back then were a lot more simple. So it was easier for them to just throw a whole bunch of them into a dungeon, I guess. But much harder for a raid where they actually needed to give those bosses mechanics. Now, all of Blackrock Depths is in the same instance, with no upper or lower parts, or different sections or wings. There's no confusion that Blackrock Depths is the biggest, and there's no hand-waving them to justify their spots on the list like with Blackrock Spire. There are so many bosses in there that it could take you an entire day to clear out the place if you knew what you were doing, or it could take you a couple of days if you didn't and just wanted to explore. In fact, the place was supposed to be even bigger, as there's a road that leads up to a gate, which looks like it was probably going to open up to something else. And they absolutely did have some plans to put something back there, or to add more to it later on in the future, or to make it an entrance to another raid, as currently you can get to Blackwing Lair and Molten Core by running through this dungeon. There's also tons of quests associated to the place that send you to other parts of the world in order to come back later, which really helped connect the dungeon itself to the world. Made it seem as it actually had a place in the grand scheme of things. It also wasn't linear with bosses. You could just kind of do them in whatever order you wanted, and they would get harder and harder the further you went in. It's probably the closest thing we have to a D&D-like dungeon in the game, and since there's so many quests and things associated to this dungeon, they kind of left it intact when they revamped it in the Cataclysm, as it still has 20 bosses available, which I think technically makes it still the longest dungeon in the game. Alright, and that's the video. For this video I made a spreadsheet with the number of bosses in every single dungeon in the game, and none of the other expansions really came close to the boss counts in Vanilla WoW dungeons, except for the Halls of Origination and Cataclysm, which randomly had 7 bosses in it. This video was edited by Felplague, and if you enjoyed the video, maybe you'd also enjoy my second Dungeons & Dragons channel, which has nothing but scripted, highly edited videos just like this WoW channel. So if you have a passing interest in that subject, you should definitely check it out as well, as it'll be linked in the video description and on the end screen right now.